So I see it on the text line that many of you are concerned about your kids. You're concerned about your high school kids, your kids that are in CEGEP or in university. You're concerned about mental health. I got to tell you something. You're not alone. Just scanning the bestseller lists, I'm looking New York Times bestseller list, Amazon bestseller list. A couple of the books at the top of the charts right now have to deal with youth mental health. Jonathan Haidt has a book out called The Anxious Generation. The Great Rewiring of Childhood is Causing an Epidemic of Mental Illness. He takes aim, he's calling, in fact, on all of us to get together and ban social media and smartphones for young people. There's one example. Abigail Schreier has a new book out called Bad Therapy, Why the Kids Aren't Growing Up. She takes aim at therapy and how we treat mental illness. And again, it's another book that's on the top of the charts. So I can see that many of you are concerned about the youth mental health crisis. And it's very real and very present. We've got some recent stats. A study shows that nearly 7 in 10 students in the U.S., so this is a U.S. figure, but 7 in 10 students in the U.S. are anxious half of the time. You know, I see that stat and it just seems outrageous. And young people seem to be more anxious and sad compared to older people. The statistics certainly back up that assessment. But along with social media and along with smartphones and along with therapy, perhaps some blame can go towards ideology, particularly, and I hate using this word, but sometimes it's the most apropos, the ideology of wokeness. Now, certainly to me, being aware of social inequalities, knowing about racial injustice, sexism, the denial of LGBT rights, these are good things. So how could there be a link between that and the current state of our kids? Eric Kaufmann is on the line. He's a professor of politics and the director of the Center for Heterodox Social Science at the University of Buckingham. He's a fellow Canadian, and he's on to the latter part of those three things that I've mentioned. Eric, welcome to the program.
Great to be here again, Elias.
Yeah, it is great to talk to you. And I think it's a subject matter that really matters for a lot of our listeners. I want to dive into what you've been focused on here, because I think a lot of people would say, it doesn't seem to line up. These are like being woke, being aware of injustice is a good thing. So how does it lead to negative outcomes? What can you tell us?
Well, I mean, first of all, woke itself, which is making sacred historically marginalized race, gender, and sexual minority groups. That's what woke is, the definition. From that follows the idea that if you do anything that might make the most sensitive member, hypothetically, of one of these groups offended, upset, etc., damage their self-esteem, then you must be excommunicated or canceled. Now, that whole set of ideas inculcates the whole idea of victimhood and a culture of victimhood where you want to take offense easily and you want to go to the authorities and report the offender. So what it doesn't teach you is resilience. And this is sort of part of the mental health picture as well, is that fragility and victimhood rather than resilience, those are the values that are inculcated. The other part of this, of course, is constantly seeking to be not normal, queer, in some way different, divergent from what's seen as the norm is also part of this package. And so if heterosexual is the norm, you want to be LGBT, for example. If male or female is the norm, there is some pressure perhaps to be different. Maybe you're non-binary.
So Eric, let me talk to you about that, because I remember being in high school and maybe it was different terms, but we had all types of people that were outside the norm, the emo group and that kind of thing. Isn't that just like, so this is where I if there's pushback, it's, well, these are just new ways of saying the same things that we had in our high school. We had all different types of disaffected groups that dress differently, and we're just a little different. Aren't we just dealing, like on that aspect, aren't we just dealing with new terms, new ways of talking about those who are different?
Well, except that those categories of difference aren't sort of imbibed with sort of moral significance and virtue. So by being sexually or different on one of the identity dimensions, race, gender, sexuality, that's actually seen as virtuous and esteemed in a way, and therefore it's accorded perhaps more prestige. And I think that's the difference really. And so if you don't have a sort of race difference, then perhaps one of the things you could be is sexually different or
Okay.
perhaps neurodivergent. Some way of being different is a way of gaining a certain amount of status in this moral system.
So, do we then have to look at the other aspects here? Because when you say that, I immediately, you know what I think of? Social media. Because that's where you've got to prove you're different or get sympathy and that kind of thing. So, everything that you say, does it not exist if we don't have the social media smartphone aspect?
Well, yeah, and that's really the connecting thread between these. So two things happen in the mid 2010s, and Haidt and Lukianoff talk about that in their book in 2018, Coddling of the American Mind. In the mid 2010s, you get this surge of mental health problems amongst young people, and you also get a surge in cancellations on campus, a surge in terms like white supremacy in the New York Times and other media. It's all happening at the same time. What is the connection? Well, one of the connections is social media. I mean, social media does a couple of things. Now, it negatively impacts mental health because people are, not going out to play, but it also spreads ideas from the campus to the rest of society, including the youth culture. And that's one of the reasons we see this ideology surging amongst young people. So they are also getting this ideology of victimhood and this victimhood culture, which I argue actually worsens their mental health. So that's why we're seeing the so-called Great Awakening and the mental health surge happening in the mid 2010s.
We're with Eric Kaufmann from the University of Buckingham. So, Eric, what's the solution to get, high school age kids who then end up here in Quebec in CEGEP and then in university? What's the solution to get them to become more resilient so that, they aren't fragile, opposite of resilient. They don't end up in that fragile state, which leads to worse mental health outcomes?
Yeah, I mean, I think it takes a root and branch reform of the dominant ideology, the sort of therapeutic, affirming ideology that exists in these schools. And that's part of that is the wokeness around identity groups, which are seen as so fragile that they can't hear the term Latino. They must hear the term Latinx, etc. But it also involves what Abigail Schreier talks about, which is not taking somebody who is maybe had a bad day and medicalizing them as depressed. Essentially being able to isolate the ones who really have mental health problems in a sustained way and separating them from the ones who are just going through the ups and downs of life when they should be taught resilience. And in fact, the therapies, the Stoicism, the CBT based on Stoicism, and that's very out of fashion, whereas the therapies that are all about affirming your feelings, whatever you think is right, that's much more in fashion. Again, these are cultural changes we need to see in the therapy industry and in the schools.
How do we get back to the liberalism, the progressive liberalism that led to all of those things that we take for granted, right? Equality for all, gay marriage, a lot of fights done in the 90s, early 2000s to get there because of liberal progressive ideals. And it seems like we've just gone off the deep end. How do we get back?
Well, yeah, I would say more liberal ideals, this idea of equal rights, rather than progressive in the sense that if progressive means the only thing that we can accept is equal outcomes and emotional harm protection, I do think that is an outgrowth of the progressivism. I think we need to dial back this excessive focus on victimhood and fragility and always seeing people as weak and in need of the authorities and try and sort of introduce more self-reliance and more resilience. And that's a cultural shift. And it's not going to come easy to people who have been drenched in critical theory and some of these sort of soft liberal ideas, which put a lot of emphasis on feelings and self-esteem and therapy. And I think that has to shift, unfortunately. It's a deeper problem in the culture.
Eric, we've dealt with we've had you on the show before, and we've talked about cancellations here. And I like I said off the top, I always hate using the word woke because it's become such a combative word, and I want to like reduce combat. But what's your latest work here? What's the reaction been this time around?
Well, I mean, I've got a couple of things. I mean, I've got the new course on Woke 15 Weeks, which has been going very well. It's an online course anyone can sign up to. I've got a report. I've got a new center for heterodox social science I've just launched. And we've got a report now looking at the US student data.
Mhm.
And there's not been a great deal of reaction necessarily to that. I mean, one of the points I'm making in this new report, which was launched yesterday, is really that the mental health part of the picture is now somewhat independent of the woke part of the picture. So if we take, for example, willingness to shout down a speaker because you don't like what they have to
Uh-huh.
say, that's mainly correlated with where you are on the ideological spectrum. If you're very left or very liberal, you're going to be more in favor of that than if you're conservative. If you're mentally ill or mentally not ill makes only a small difference to that. So my argument is in a way that it's not the mental illness that's driving woke, it's
Mhm.
more the woke ideology that's actually fueling mental illness. And so it's important to get that causal
Mhm.
story right. That's one of my arguments.
Eric, we got to leave it there. Thanks so much for taking the time for our listeners this morning.
Thanks so much, Elias.
Eric Kaufmann is professor of politics and director of the Center for Heterodox Social Science at the University of Buckingham. Fellow Canadian right there.